Cool.
Awesome. Kia ora, welcome everybody. We'll get started very shortly, but we'll just allow a few more people to filter into the lobby here. As a quick intro, we'll do some formal intros shortly, but we're joined here with Aleida Powell from our Wellington office. Aleida has recently been to Downstream along with Roger, and they're going to share some perspectives from the conference, what it means for us practically, and how can we integrate these takeaways into the work we do every day. So as we go through this webinar, it's going to be fairly casual, be some back and forth conversation. So if you have questions, please chuck them in the Q&A chat as we go through. And as we find times, we'll bring up some of these questions and ask them as we go through. There'll also be a bit of time to ask questions at the end. So please filter those in to the chat box there and we'll get started shortly. Roger, you're in Christchurch today. What's it looking like down there?
It's a bit grey. We started off a bit foggy, but I got on my bike this morning, biked up to the top of the Port Hills above the fog, and it was actually really beautiful. So sometimes fog can be attractive as well. But I guess if I was trying to fly into Christchurch today or fly out of Christchurch, maybe that fog would have been less attractive. There we go.
Hey, always a good reason to get on the bike. And Aleida, how's Wellington this morning?
Always great. Love Wellington. Weather's always fantastic, and you can't let anyone say otherwise. No, I would agree. It was a chilly ride to work this morning. But now it looks like an all right day. So
fantastic. Oh, that's
maybe
great.
not a good day. Maybe not one of Wellington's best days, but looks pretty good.
The best we can hope for in Wellington. Yeah. Well, look, this is great, and let's just take some of this time while people are filtering in. We'll start off in about 2 minutes. We'll just have a quick chat. I'm sure most of you know who Deta are, but what do we actually stand for? At Deta, we got this big 10-year goal. We're looking to remove 2 million tonnes of carbon emissions by the year 2030. And we do this through the work we do with our clients, where we kind of focus on a couple of main offerings: sustainability and strategy, decarbonisation pathways, project development and delivery, and strategic support. So we sit alongside a lot of our clients and help them design where they're going. So it's kind of assess where we are, look where we need to go, and implement those changes. So we pride ourselves on giving that good, independent advice to help develop those throughout businesses. So we work a lot in food and beverage, brewing and distilling, industrial processes, a bit of government consulting as well, and also buildings and infrastructure. So we're across New Zealand's primary sector and other sectors as well. So we've got a breadth of knowledge. So as we go through this webinar, if you want to reach out and know a wee bit more, please reach out to either any of the speakers you see here today or through to Deta, and we've got a good landing page on our website for that. So we work across Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific. And that's really interesting because we see a lot of the learnings that we have from places like Downstream, and we can see how we can apply these into different regions, but they're all a wee bit different. And I think as we go through, we'll talk about some of the contrasts to the Australian market as we go through as well. But without further ado, let's get started, and I'll introduce our panelists. So today we'll be hearing from Roger. Roger has 30 years in the wider energy industry. He spent his early career in the generation sector, where he served and worked on many working groups that designed the wholesale energy market that we have today. So rightly or wrongly, we can blame Roger for that. But he has extensive experience in the network sector, working in government. He's acted as chair and director for ECA, Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, and now sits with Deta, providing high-level strategic advice to our clients. We also have Aleida. Aleida is a master's graduate from the University of Otago with a qualification in energy science and technology. She's now based up here in our Wellington office and did a lot of research while she was at uni using Meridian's energy electricity systems model and projecting forward some of these 100% renewable futures that we may have and what implications those have on our wider kind of New Zealand context, and specifically the impacts of bringing in EVs charging into that EDB kind of focus and question, and how are we going to service that into the future. At Deta, Aleida does a lot of work with our EDBs. And finally, Dr. Stomiklum, I will be the host and MC for today. My background's industrial R&D, having developed high-efficiency chemical fertilizers through my PhD, working at an agri-tech startup called Hotline Labs, and now working here at Deta, where I focus on biogas, biomass, and a whole bunch of renewable energy options. And then outside of Deta, I work with the IGO supporting the sustainable energy transition amongst the Commonwealth countries. So that's enough for me. Downstream, let's jump into it. So I'll pop this away so we can see all our panel. So Downstream happened at the start of this month here in Wellington. What was it? Who was there? And why do we care? Roger, do you want to lead us off on that?
So it's an annual conference run by a private organisation who run the daily energy news website. About 400 or 500 people turn up, wide variety of speakers from people from one or two customers, people talking about the gas sector. We had both our Minister of Energy and also Shane Jones spoke. So, a wide variety of speakers and a wide variety of people attending as well.
Awesome. And Aleida, do you want to tell us a little bit more about kind of your perspectives from it as well? As a young professional in the space, how did you find the conference? What valuable insights did you pick up, and would you encourage others to go as well?
Yeah, I think this year the Young Energy Professional Network ran for the first time the scholarship opportunity for young professionals to be able to attend the conference, to kind of try and bridge this gap between kind of the energy sector and also the young professionals coming through. It was really interesting, I think, being there from that perspective, that I had a lot of conversations about people being the accidental energy professional, just kind of falling into this industry. And while there, we had a lot of conversations around, well, how do we stop people kind of falling into the industry? Like, how do we kind of make this like something that's accessible that people kind of move into? So from a young professional, that I was quite involved in some of that stuff. But I think for me personally, like, there was a big takeaway was just kind of seeing like this debate on going around, is it a sense of urgency in the transition or not? And I kind of felt like it was a bit of a different change of pace from some of the other events I've been to. We've been really focused on this net zero 2050 and we need a decarb right now. And there is this sense of urgency I felt like at Downstream this year, there was a lot of talk about, well, how do we do this right? And how do we do it in a way that is going to be a less regrets scenario, does incur huge cost on the customer, and does keep the lights on through that transition period while we try to reach that net zero 2050. So from that perspective, it was really interesting hearing those kinds of conversations, I guess, particularly because the gas industry was there to kind of give their 2 cents.
Interesting. I love that. I love that foundation of this needs to be part of a just transition. How do we do it? We can build, we can do it all now, but there is massive cost implications for that. So how do we do that in a fair and equitable way going forward? And I think that leads into probably a first point that we can jump off for discussion, which is net zero 2050, as you say. We need 80% growth in the electricity market and generation. That needs to be renewable. So I guess, Roger, how can we achieve this increase in renewables, and what kind of implications will this have on the wider market?
Yeah, so we're going to have a lot more wind and solar coming onto the power system. At the moment, there's a small amount of solar, and wind on some days makes up 20, maybe 25% of the generation. But going forward, we're going to see the amount of wind and solar go up massively. And that means we're going to see a lot more volatility, if you like, in the underlying wholesale electricity price. Some days we're going to have more energy than we know what to do with. And then on days like today in Christchurch, days where there's cloud over the country or fog and there's no wind, then energy prices are going to be really high. So we're going to see an awful lot more volatility in that energy price. And I think that's really the overall thing that I got out of it. We're going to see more volatility. We're going to see a whole lot of money spent building these new wind turbines, these new solar farms. But we're also going to spend a whole lot of money as well building new transmission and distribution networks to connect all this new load. So there's a whole lot of challenges coming up.
Yeah, definitely. I think like on that investment piece, some huge numbers were thrown around almost just like casually, but the scale of investment is going to be huge. I think it was something like from the BCG report that I know gets quoted quite a lot. It looks like $42 billion of investment is going to be needed, and a huge chunk of that, as Roger said, is actually just in the transmission and distribution infrastructure. So we need to build all this new renewables. It's like quite clear that that's a focus, but actually how are we then getting it to the customers? And that's like an equally big part of the investment problem.
Yeah, and once again, we throw around these numbers, 42 billion. I mean, it's just such a strange number. What does it mean?
Yeah.
But I mean, in some ways, I went out and thought it's about $7,000 for every household in the country, assuming that the households meet only a third of the cost of that 42 billion. So they're really, really big numbers. And I think we're going to have an interesting challenge as the industry spends that money and the demand hasn't turned up yet, then prices are going to go up. And I think that's going to be tough for a lot of people. For smart people like me who've already bought the electric car and has a huge hot water cylinder that's heated at night, it's less of an issue. But for people who haven't got that same access to capital that I have, it's going to be difficult, eh?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think there was something else that came up, like kind of recurring throughout Downstream, was like this idea that there is huge investment that's going to be needed, but at the end of the day, that investment is coming from the customers. Like the customers are paying for that, and then how are we passing these costs on to the customers? And the fact that they are going to be paying for this transition, and the numbers are going to be really big. And kind of is that fear? Like we're in a cost of living crisis. The price of people's power bills is already seen as too high, and we're saying that it's going to have to go up if we're going to meet our obligations and kind of meet the need in this transition. And like Roger said, that investment has to come before the demand. So how is that going to be achieved?
Yeah, and it's definitely that short and long-term problem. How do we invest enough today to support tomorrow without, those big cost implications? And there's definitely going to be a lot of thought and consideration going into how we fund that, how we structure the debt around that, because as you say, we can't pay for it all today. And that's going to have some long-term implications on the grid. And I think interestingly as well, Aleida, in your research at University of Otago, you were looking at these renewable futures, and I think you're looking out to 2040. And it actually changes the grid quite a bit, right? What kind of implications and changes do you think we'll see over this time?
Yeah, definitely. I think with the modelling work that I've done, and also I guess reflecting on other New Zealand modelling studies, that as Roger said, with the huge increase in renewable penetration, you do get those extremes in volatility. So it'd be like really low electricity prices, really high renewable generation, and then that just flips. Like the volatility of the market needs to be stabilized by something. And in New Zealand, especially if we're trying to move towards like higher renewables, move away from gas and coal use, that stability is coming from hydro at this stage. But also we're going to need more stability. And so kind of the work that I've done in the past has been looking at different ways in which we get that stability, in which we can kind of mitigate some of the volatility of the market, mostly through flexible use of demand, so demand-side management initiatives. So just the efficient and effective use of demand response can really limit the impact that those volatile prices have. If you can use electricity when it's there and kind of pull back when it's not, then it's starting to kind of mitigate the impacts, but from a demand side perspective. And the same with EVs. EVs is a huge one. We're expecting pretty much an 100% electric fleet by the time we get to 2050. The charging demand from that is going to be huge. So that how can we use that in a way that it's flexible and smart and matches this renewable output? And I think we heard at Downstream, we had some really good conversations from the work that's already been done in this space, and like the Flex Talk projects and all the kind of flexibility platforms and Octopus Energy and the work that they're doing. But it's kind of about, it needs to be smart. Like the controller EVs needs to be smart. And that was one thing I guess that came out of my research particularly, was that just shifting heaps of demand to at night isn't necessarily the best answer when you have such a high amount of renewables, when the only stabilizing factor is our hydro inflows. That if all your demand's at night, you can't really use solar as much. And kind of in the end, it resulted in we needed more types of kind of that baseload demand to try and meet things, especially high demand at night. So
I'll bring up
John,
those graphs that you sent through later, because I found them really interesting. They should just be coming up on the screen now. Of that volatility that you speak of, we've got this current trend shown in that grey curve, and what those predictions look like to 2040. And as you say, it changes how we use our EVs. Do you kind of want to explain the implications of these graphs here?
Yeah, definitely. So I think like the first one showing like the intraday average price is really showing like the price of electricity is going to change quite a bit, and that impact is from the high amounts of renewable generation that we're expecting to see. So like big drops in price in the middle of the day because we're going to have a lot more solar and the wind's going to be blowing. But then higher prices at peak times because kind of in the absence, or as we kind of move away from gas peaking plant, we're going to have less kind of peaking options. Like, what are those peaking options going to be? And the cost of those is going to be higher. So what you're seeing there in the orange curve is that increased volatility of price. It's not quite as flat like in the grey curve. And then same if you look at the seasonal average price, the grey line for kind of today is somewhat flat, especially kind of compared to this 2040 picture, which is really showing like a big increase over winter. And that's kind of the result of this dry year. Well, not necessarily dry year, but the fact that like we're basing our generation on kind of like these high renewables that in periods of a winter when demand's high, sun's probably low, that the price of electricity is going to be a lot higher than compared to over summer.
Mm.
I think the other thing that kind of hits me here is my hot water cylinder. I heat it at night, and I think, as Aleida was saying, in the summer, am I going to be heating my hot water instead of at night with cheap electricity? Am I going to be heating it during the day, trying to absorb some of that stuff as well?
Exactly, that's the flexibility of the flexibility. It can't be a static flexibility,
I think the other thing that I kind of picked up from, there was some people came along and talked about offshore wind. And I thought that was interesting because I'd never really had to think about offshore wind up until now. And offshore wind, you need really big scale. You're not going to build a 100 megawatt new offshore wind farm. You're going to build 500 megawatts or 1,000 megawatts or 1,500 megawatts, really big. But also, I thought the other interesting thing was offshore wind, from some of the stuff I've seen and some of the discussion, produces more energy in winter than it does in summer. And PwC have just come out with a piece of work outlining that. And I thought that was really interesting, that potentially offshore wind, while it's going to be a lot more expensive than onshore wind, it's got these other characteristics as well, like more winter energy, which is what we need. We need more winter power.
That's interesting. Can we dig a wee bit more into that? How do we expect our generation portfolio to change as climate change happens, and as we approach this net zero 2050 goal? I guess, is it going to be the same situation that we see now, or are those kind of patterns and proportions of generation going to change?
Well, we're going to see more of these, more wind and solar. I think it's important we end up building wind and solar in places that aren't all too correlated. There's no point every wind turbine in the country spinning at exactly the same time. We need them in places where it's calm everywhere else. And I think that's a bit behind what Mercury are doing. Mercury are building a big wind farm down in Southland, simply because when there's a high over the country, the wind is still blowing out the back of Gore and Invercargill. And I think the other interesting thing, and I think there's a piece of work we should do, is just on the solar story. Which parts of New Zealand does the sun shine brightest in dry hydro years? And maybe we need to start thinking now about starting to build some transmission or distribution capacity to those places, because that energy is going to be really valuable. The dry year, the windless year thing, that's going to be a big issue, and we need to start thinking now how we're going to solve those sorts of issues.
Yeah, because it was quite interesting at Downstream. We heard from Dr. Jen Purdy, who I've worked with in the past, and she does a lot of work on kind of the climate impacts of electricity generation.
That was interesting.
From the work that she's done, she's seen that based off, I guess, what we're expecting to happen as the climate kind of warms, the impact of that is actually more hydro inflows in the South Island, but slightly less in the North Island. So it's kind of like increasing the amount of generation that we're going to have down south, but it's not fixing the problem up north. And then also we're expected to have kind of more capacity for wind generation, like the wind's going to blow harder, I guess, and that is expected to be pretty much across the country. So in that sense, it's a good news story, but I think taking those things into account is something that she's really saying is going to be really important for designing kind of these generation portfolios going forward.
And I think the other thing that I got out of the whole sort of that future thing about the dry year thing is how do we give incentives for people to keep their old coal and gas boilers, as they electrify the process and they put in a big heat pump, and they've got a 10 megawatt coal boiler. Are they going to keep that coal boiler for dry hydro years? Are they going to be incentivized by the retailers to do that? And I think that's a really important concept, that we think about these other ways we're going to keep our power system resilient, which isn't just about on-slow, which as obviously doesn't look like it's going to happen now, but other innovative ways of doing it. But it's also, I think it's worth reflecting, New Zealand does have its challenges going forward with this whole having more renewables, but I think our challenges are less than most other places in the world because we already have the batteries in the form of the hydros. Most places don't have that big hydro base.
I think, Roger, it's interesting you bring up the innovation point, because I think that was something that was talked about quite a bit. Like there was this call to, like, where are the incentives in the market and where is the innovation in the market that would incentivize people to want to be able to participate in flexibility platforms, to want to do the demand response, like that incentive isn't really there at this stage.
All that, I mean, if that was one thing that comes out of this whole conference is, the opportunity for customers who are smarter, who can turn loads on and off, who've invested in the hot water storage tank as part of their new big heat pump system, who can turn their coal store on and off. Those opportunities are much greater now than they have been in the past, and those opportunities are going to get greater. But also those things are actually going to have wider system benefits as well. The more smart customers we've got that turn load off when prices are high, when emissions are high, then that actually keeps energy prices for everyone else down as well. And on top of that, you've kind of got the network issue as well. The networks are about to spend large amounts of money. They are going to want to find more flexible load as well, because the more flexible load they have, the less they're going to have to spend really big sums of money digging up roads, building new substations, and all those other things they need to do to meet these new loads. So the smart customer is going to do well. And I think that's the role we're going to have, is trying to work with those smart customers, thinking about how they can be more flexible and innovative and how they use energy.
And that goes to a really what's going to be quite a deep equity question that we have to answer between consumers, like residential consumers, industrial customers, and making sure that is equitable and supporting that just transition there. We're also getting
and Tom, that's a really good point, because I mean, I have my big hot water cylinder. I've got my EV. I'm looking forward to putting a controller onto my hot water cylinder when I go on the contact, 3 hours of free power at 9 o'clock. And if you're a low-income person living out the back of Taita, or a low-income person living in Aranui and Christchurch in a rented property, those opportunities are much, much less. So I think it's going to be something the wider electricity industry is going to have to tackle with some enthusiasm if they're going to keep their social license.
Interesting. So we're also getting a few questions coming through on the Q&A, and I encourage everyone to keep on populating those in and asking questions, and we'll jump into them as we can. We got one good question here, which is, what are both of your thoughts on kind of battery storage? Will it continue to get cheaper? And I guess with this volatility offered by wind and solar, how do you see these kind of probably smaller scale, but also larger scale batteries fitting into it, and where do you see their purpose in the grid in the future?
I think there's huge scope for increased use of batteries, definitely at like the distribution scale. Like if you can kind of generate electricity or store electricity and use it where it's needed, instead of kind of relying on like a grid scale storage solution, that's going to have a lot of benefit. Because, well, first of all, I guess you kind of limit the impact of lines losses and all of that, but also it's it's kind of also brings in, like, if you can do it at like a local or community level, it helps achieve some of that social license that Roger's talking about. Like, it's then something that's a resource to that place. Now, I think that could be something really important going forward.
I bet you. I mean, I think that the battery's close to the customer. That you have the advantage that the customer gets the resilience benefit. The line losses. You just have the economies of scale. Sometimes with grid batteries are going to beat that smaller battery. We are seeing lots of new battery technologies coming along. Like we heard at Downstream from a company called Arc Active, and they think they're about to reduce the cost of grid scale and home batteries by about a factor of 3, about a third of the cost. So there's a whole lot of other technologies coming along. But we also need to remember that there's actually just existing technologies right now that we've got to use better. Our hot water and all those sorts of things. There's a whole lot of other really cheap ways of us storing energy as well. But I think the battery is going to have a big role going forward.
Yeah, definitely. Those hot water systems and where we can store energy as a thermal battery ourselves is really interesting. We've got another question coming through. This one's from Australia, actually, that they're seeing transmission costs increase kind of 4x to account for some of these larger renewable connections and kind of growth in the grid. I guess, how does the growth in renewables in New Zealand compare to Australia, and what's the kind of differences we can compare and contrast between the two?
Which
I think. Oh, you go first, Roger.
Well, I was going to say, Australia's been well ahead of us in terms of in the solar thing. They've built solar really fast, and they've got, I think, like 20 gigawatts of solar capacity now. So they're ahead of us in that way. But overall, we've still got a much more renewable grid than they have. Although at certain times in Australia or parts of Australia, they've now got their grid is 100% renewable for short periods of time when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. But in some ways, the thing I think we could help the Australians with is things like controlling load more smartly. So I think if I was thinking about how to become more sustainable in South Australia, and I had a choice between spending money on controlling the electric hot water cylinders so they absorb the free surplus solar power or putting in more solar panels, I think the control of those solar panels would actually be, the control of that hot water system would be a far more sustainable thing than just more solar or more wind. So I think we can both teach each other things at the moment. Aleida.
Yeah, I think like specifically thinking of the transmission pricing, the one thing that we've talked about at Downstream, like we had a speaker come over and talk about kind of the insights from the Australian market as a focus session. And one thing he said is that they're looking now to invest more in kind of connecting up the different grids within Australia. And that the cost of being able to do that is huge. It means putting in huge transmission lines connecting across Australia in ways that have never been done before. But the benefit of that is going to be that if the wind's blowing and the sun's shining in one part of Australia, instead of having to kind of reach these negative price periods or that generation just not actually being able to be used, instead of being spilt, like being able to then shift that over to somewhere else in Australia that might need it, that could use that renewable generation at that time. So in that sense, they kind of start getting like the variability of supply by connecting it up across Australia. But he did highlight that the cost of doing that is huge. And I do wonder if maybe, I don't know specifically about transmission pricing in Australia, but I wonder if that is maybe having a role in there.
I thought the thing you were going to talk about later was was negative prices. Australia gets these negative electricity prices. So you actually paid to charge your car, which I thought was kind of a strange concept. And that's because they've got these big thermal plants they've got to keep warm during the day so they can meet the peak load at night. So yeah, negative prices. You actually paid to actually here's a graph. I thought that was fascinating. Just understanding about negative prices. I'm not sure we're ever going to get to negative prices in New Zealand, but they're very much a function of the fact they've got big thermal plants they want to keep running for during the day so they can meet the peak load at night.
Yeah, they can't turn the thermal plant off, so it's still running. But then also just this huge uptake of rooftop solar, and then having all of that kind of exporting back into the grid, as well as like having other renewables generating kind of in the middle of the day at the same time as rooftop solar. There's been that that during some periods of the day, they actually have more renewable generation than what they can use, but also they still have the thermal plant running because they can't turn it off because they need it at peak times. Just quite interesting, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it actually segues nicely into another question that we've got coming through, and that's I'll probably leave it to you, Roger, to start on this. With your experience kind of running an EDB, how important is time of use charging, and should we start to roll this out to residential and commercial customers on a mandatory basis? How would that tie in with the kind of EDB operations?
So I think some sort of time of use pricing is going to be important. I don't know if you need to mandate it, but I think encourage people to use energy at off-peak times is an important thing. I think we need to be important. We don't just end up having so much load coming on at the off-peak time, which in Christchurch is 9 o'clock. You end up actually running another peak. So I think time of use pricing is important, but I think controlling flexible loads is almost more important. So saying to, hey, Roger, if we can control your hot water cylinder, so it comes on when your local distribution system isn't heavily loaded, I think that's going to be really important. If we can control when we can charge your EV, I think so. Time of use pricing, but I think pricing where you give up control of when certain things happen, I think is potentially just as important. And I think also for our industrial customers, I think we're going to see many more sort of smart pricing signals coming from networks to try and so they don't have to build such big networks so quickly. And I think that's going to, at the moment, there's some of that sort of dynamic pricing from the Orions, from Aurora. I think we're going to see more of that sort of pricing roll out over time around the country. As those networks spend big money, they're going to need smart pricing signals to try and get customers to invest in that demand side stuff to keep peak loads down at those constrained times.
Aleida, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing that, obviously this was the first time I'd been to Downstream, but something that came up a couple of times was that we've been talking about implementing time of use pricing since who knows when. It's been a recurring theme at many conferences, and we still haven't done it. So I agree with you, Roger, that time of use pricing is going to have a role, but actually just the flexible controller assets is going to be much more valuable. But as an interim step, surely time of use pricing is something that we should be incentivizing now. And then also it could be potentially kind of that first step in getting the customer engagement to want to participate in those flexibility services. I've had some involvement kind of working with customers in terms of the energy behavior use, more residential, small sales customers. But I think at Deta, we've kind of seen it as well, I guess, at the commercial industrial scale, that initially there isn't quite that trust to be able to go, okay, EDB or third party control my load and it'll be fine. That trust needs to be built somehow. And maybe that kind of time use pricing and kind of easing into sort of the idea of flexibility, the idea of kind of demand side management might be a good way to get kind of that buy-in from customers to be able to do it. Especially when we've kind of highlighted, or it's highlighted in the industry quite often, that these flexibility services are going to have a huge role. We're really going to rely on them going forward to be able to kind of match that variability of renewable supply, to kind of match the variability in prices that we're going to see in the market, but actually getting the customers to want to be involved, to see the benefit, to see the incentives, to get the buy-in to actually do it is going to be quite important.
Yeah, I really like that. I really like the kind of shift in mindset here to the consumer. And I think we've got a whole lot of opportunities. We hear from Roger, he's going down and switching off his cylinder during the day, and turn it on at night when the pricing's low. I guess, is this normal consumer behavior, and how can we support the consumers either through incentives or automation and stuff to enable this work to happen? Because I guess we can easily, while working in the energy industry, know about a whole lot of these things and be incentivized and interested in following these energy efficiency and cost efficiency programs. But how can we push that to the general consumer base, and who are they?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because the first question is, who are they? I don't know if the industry, from my experience, has a good understanding of who the customers are. And, you know, your question of, is Roger's behavior normal customer behavior? Well, I'd say there
I'm
probably
not
is no
normal.
normal. Oh, well, yeah, he's not normal. There we go. But like, there probably is no necessarily normal customer behavior. Like, there are different types of customers, and those customers are going to behave in a certain way. But we need to have that understanding of that to make sure that no customer group is left behind, but also that the energy services and the way that kind of like we format these flexibility platforms to operate, or the way that we engage with customers, is actually going to be fit for purpose. That we're kind of achieving this customer centric kind of end goal through actually involving the customer and understanding the customer from like the early stages.
We do need more engaged customers, but we also need retailers who know how to connect with their customers.
Yeah,
There was a bit of talk at Downstream about how the gentailers, it's very hard competing with the big gentailers if you're a small retailer. So there was a bit of negative talk there from the smaller retailers, and they're really making the point: if you do want innovation, they don't think they're getting a very fair deal. But long term, we want smart retailers doing innovative things, and we want the smart retailer who controls my hot water cylinder really smartly, who controls when my EV is charged. I'm not sure I want them to tell them when I'm going to use the bread maker, but overall, those big loads, we do want them doing smart things.
Interesting. We've got some questions as well coming through about who was in the room at Downstream. Was there a big industrial kind of cohort of people there thinking, as you say, well, both of you talking about industrial users and how they changed their use profile. Were they present here, or were they part of the discussion?
They weren't there in big numbers, no. This isn't a particularly cheap conference, and no, the industrial customers weren't there in real numbers. And I think we as an industry, the wider energy industry, needs to work with them really collaboratively on this next stage with them.
Yeah. And I think to Roger's point, it was there wasn't a lot of kind of participation from customer groups in general. Like, that was something that was quite lacking. And I think part of that kind of just comes down to the accessibility of kind of the event and how it's kind of structured to go out to. Like, it's the kind of event that the energy professionals go to, but we're not actually hearing enough from kind of the customers. Or now that the energy system is kind of more than just poles and wires, we need to be hearing more from kind of these other groups that are now going to be kind of relied upon in the energy transition.
But a really simple fundamental point is, if we're going to get more renewables, we get greater volatility, customers need to participate more, we need more active customers, whether they're active themselves or have got an agent doing things for them. If we're going to beat climate change with more renewable electricity, we need much more smart customers doing smart things.
Yeah, interesting. We've got we talk a lot about how we use energy when we use it. What about efficiency? And I know when Jono and I were at COP, this came up a lot. How is the efficiency of how we use energy, the focus of what we do? And I think with a lot of thermal systems, we talk about efficiency. How can we do better with this? But not always about electrical systems. Was there any discussion about the efficiency side of things at the conference?
Not much that I heard, but I think energy efficiency is nearly always the cheapest way of us actually keeping the lights on. And I think sometimes we can get so excited by these new generation technologies, we forget that actually saving energy has a whole lot of other benefits as well. So I think going forward, energy efficiency is going to be more important than ever. In particular, energy efficiency at times when we know our networks are heavily loaded, because we know we're going to be spending lots of money to keep the lights on in winter. So energy efficiency is also going to be important going forward as well.
Yeah, I think the only time that I can kind of remember energy efficiency coming into the conversation, I think, was when we were hearing from the consumer group that presented, that the talk of, like, for consumers that are able to invest in kind of the more efficient technology are going to benefit from that when the prices of electricity go up, as opposed to the kind of customer groups that aren't able to invest in the efficiency options. and kind of highlighting that efficiency is going to actually need to be a really big focus. I think this was focused probably more at like the residential sector, but across customers, that if electricity prices are going to keep going up the way they are, and if affordability is going to be an issue or continue to be an issue, that actually we need to come back to those kind of first principles of energy efficiency. And like energy efficiency is the first type of decarbonisation, because if you can use less as a starting point, you've already reduced your emissions. But like I think it wasn't kind of talked about so much in that sense as it was in terms of how are we going to keep costs down to the customers when the price is just going to keep going up.
Yeah, great stuff. And I guess to continue this on as well, we talk a lot about resilience. So there we talk about resilience of the grid to dry years, and how we protect against that, probably against brownouts and other forms of resilience in the grid. But we also have resilience to natural disasters. And Roger, you obviously headed up the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. How do we need to think about our network and plan forward to enable this recovery and resilience to these natural disasters? And we've seen a few happen recently. How do we best do that and think about it?
Well, I guess we just need to engage, first of all, we need to engage with our customers. How resilient do they want to? How resilient do they want it? And then we need to think about all the different scenarios, and then we just need to start investing. I guess we also need to invest so that as we do those things, we tick off as many of the different, we tick as many boxes as we can. So, Aleida's point about, the batteries. Batteries have got this sustainability thing. We're using more off-peak energy, saving up wind, but can also give, resilience to bits of the network when the tree comes down across the line. But I mean, I think we're going to have to continue to invest in this stuff, and I think it's important we don't just we don't get so obsessed with the sustainability line that we forget we also have to keep the lights on as well.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess also with a report came out earlier this month that was from Rewiring Aotearoa, and it said, with the cost of home solar and batteries coming down and a bit more focus on a fair price to sell electricity back into the grid, is that starting to affect our decisions around investment and how much we need to invest into the grid? Is that going to have a meaningful impact on our network?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always, if you put, the thing I didn't quite get with that report is I always think grid-based solar is cheaper than on the roofs, because you have the economies of scale. The grid-based solar, the panels are actually at an angle that they get the winter sun, and that's what we're really short of. I think solar on the roofs is going to have a role, but I think we need to make sure we're not just doing stuff that feels nice and looks nice. We do need a wide diversity of renewable energy. If everyone has solar on the roofs in Auckland, then how are we going to keep the lights on in those cold, sunless days? So we need to be careful we don't just go after things that make us feel good.
I think to just add to that as well, and also I guess it links back to that point about resilience, is that I think Roger's right. The economies of scale that you get from the grid scale solar have a lot of benefits. But the benefits that you can achieve kind of, I guess, from the rooftop aspect are different, and that you get more of that resilience piece. So, for example, like in the Cyclone Gabriel response, the houses that had solar panels and batteries were actually able to keep some circuits of their house on. They still had some electricity connection even when the lights were out, and that became not just important for them in that their lights and fridges stayed on, but as like a community kind of hub, and that people could come and like charge their phones, or they could like come and like have a bit of power for a second because it was there. So there was quite an importance in that respect.
Yeah, interesting. And we focus a lot on electricity, right? But there are many energy forms that we use. And you mentioned earlier, Aleida, that the natural gas industry were kind of at the conference as well, talking about transition plans and what it means for them. I think we can see gas as something that we are transitioning out of, and and managing that transition. So I guess what was the headlines from the gas industry, and kind of what messaging did they have?
I think for me, I found their messaging a little bit unclear, but to the way you just described it, and that we should be transitioning away from gas, it almost felt like the narrative from them is we should be transitioning to gas to supply the resilience in those cold, like dry winter years. That's kind of where they really see the role of gas being for that, and kind of highlighting that in the absence of a Lake Onslow solution or any other kind of investment to really firm up our dry year options, that gas is going to be our best low carbon option going forward, which I thought was quite interesting. But then they also talked a lot about the role of biogas going forward, and seemed quite convinced that biogas is going to have quite a substantial role. Yeah.
I think biogas almost certainly will have a role, but we're not going to be running Huntley on biogas. We're not going to be running any big Fonterra boilers on biogas. So it may have some role, and we just need to make sure we're thinking about, I think overall electricity is going to be the way most of our new renewable energy is going to come from.
Yeah, I think when I talked about biogas, I kind of talked about it in terms of the estimated proportions of biogas availability in New Zealand were kind of seeming to match up with around about what we're using at a residential level. So kind of saying that potentially biogas is going to be our solution to decarbonising residential gas use. But other kind of reports I've already read, I guess, probably more from the electricity sector, kind of say, well, there's already lower cost benefits from switching over to electricity from gas, that I'm not entirely sure why we'd need biogas to play a role in the residential space if that was the case. But
yeah, and I guess I'll take the opportunity to kind of swap hats here from that of the MC into one of the panelists. So I do some of the work here at Deta for kind of biogas development, and work with bands on the steering committee for biogas kind of steering committee. And so we look at biogas, and it's a really great resource. Personally, I think that it's really good used on location. So co-locating it with an industrial user, with the manufacturing plant that generates some of these wastes. Admittedly, you're going to bring other wastes in from other regions, and we see really cool work happening with EcoGas, who are, digesting organic waste from Auckland City Council. The directive exists across New Zealand for other councils to follow suit and manage these organic wastes that they have. So we'll see more biogas.
And I think I think that's a great thing, Tom. I think we just need to be careful. We don't think it's going to solve all our issues.
Yeah, agreed. And I think when we can use it locally, it's really great. If we can partner with a facility and use raw biogas straight with minor cleaning, it works really well. If we use it in a way that we form biomethane, you can get really high return on that investment, but it's a really involved process. You're pressurizing up this gas and spending a lot of energy to pressurize it, get into the pipeline. So my view on it would be it's really great locally for an industrial users, but yeah, as you say, I think it will feature, but I don't think it's going to be the game change that solves all the issues here. Excellent. I guess I got another question coming through here about how this demand side flexibility and response of industrial clients, would that have, and load shedding and shifting loads, how will that impact industrial clients? And do you think that's good for New Zealand Inc? It may have some production implications, I'm sure, but what's the overall feel?
Yeah, so I'm not really suggesting that someone who's making widgets stops the widget manufacture. What I'm suggesting is that someone who has a 10,000 ton cool store might run it harder overnight, or at times when energy prices are low, and use that cool store as a battery. I'm suggesting that when someone is putting in a new heat pump hot water system to replace the coal boiler, that they might actually have 100,000 tons of hot water storage as part of it to allow them to have effectively a thermal battery. So all that will have benefits, because it means less money is spent on the electricity system, keeping the lights on for everybody else. Does that make some sense, Tom?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's great clarification there as well.
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well, like the with industrial demand response, I don't think it's not a one size fits all. It's probably going to be very much tailored to the site and the site needs. And all solutions I think that have been rolled out at this stage are tailored to the site needs, but not everything is switching off your electric boiler or heat pump system for 6 hours and stopping production for a week or anything like that. There are different kind of levels of demand response. There's the opportunity to participate in kind of like frequency response or the fast reserves market and just turning off the once they're like 30 or 60 seconds at a time, like quite short intervals, that if your production can handle that, then that would be an option. Or even kind of like these longer demand response plans that we're seeing and kind of encouraging our customers to consider when they are looking at these kind of bigger full site decarbonisation plans, to look at ways of, if you're installing a new electric alternative, keeping kind of your thermal plant as well, so that in a dry year option, in a dry year, you have the option to kind of switch over to use the thermal plant and you get paid for that. There's a benefit in doing that. And well, that kind of almost might seem silly that from an emissions reduction perspective, you want to get rid of the thermal plant. You don't want to keep it. You're trying to reduce emissions. But actually, if you can use your little boiler and stop Huntly running, well, then that's much better. So keeping those kind of options in our decarbonisation kind of roadmaps and plans is something that we incorporate to kind of help allow for the industrial customers to look at those demand response options when they do decarbonise.
Yeah, and that's really good. I think we've got a question along those lines in the chat as well around the emissions from these companies. So we've got greater reporting requirements under the ASX and NZX as well around what your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are. And when we look to this process of electrification, I think companies are interested in it for many reasons. I think it's an emissions reduction piece. It's a efficiency piece. When you're renewing capital, you definitely get much more control with some of these electrical systems. So I think there's many reasons people are looking to do this transition. But as you say, Aleida, keeping some of these assets in reserve is actually quite a good thing. If they're not being used, they're not emitting carbon. But we're looking at that.
Can I chime in here, because I'm an old generation guy?
Yeah.
Not like these bloody young Wellington people we've got. But Huntly produces electricity at about a 35% efficiency. A coal boiler is typically more like 85% efficient. So there's just this 3 times more efficient burning coal directly rather than trying to burn it at Huntly. Yeah. But I think it's also worth saying that we are seeing, putting our Deta hats on, we are seeing some of the big gentailers are working pretty positively with customers about smart things like keep that coal boiler or that gas boiler for the dry years. We are seeing the big generator retailers doing some pretty innovative, cool things in that region, which is great.
Yeah, definitely. I think that innovation is going to be key, as you say, but also that holistic solution. We can't look just at retailers, industrial clients.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there's one thing, the way emissions are counted at the moment. If you buy electricity, your scope 2 emissions are the same, whether you're buying them on a summer day when the sun is shining and that energy has effectively 0 emissions, or whether you're buying it on a 6 o'clock on a winter's night when Huntly is the guy or the woman producing that last kilowatt hour of energy. So it's an open question about how we want to come up with smarter emission factors that give credit to people doing smart things and penalise the person who isn't so smart and just carries on using energy even when it's coming from a really polluting place.
And I guess the extension of that, if we look into the biggest cases, we think about dairy, who use a lot of energy in the spring, not in that winter peak that we see.
Right.
Yeah. And how that compares to companies who may have flat generation profiles. As you say, that emissions factor does change significantly across the year, across the day. And when we choose to do things, are we testing our diesel generators at a time when it's going to be most beneficial for the grid, or are we doing it when oh, we've come back off smoke and we're ready to, try this out and switch our load over. We can be smarter about how we
And
do.
some people, getting those messages across is really hard. I was talking to someone the other day who has a backup diesel generator. And they were saying, look, we don't like running it because of the emissions, even in response to a peak demand pricing signal. I said, well, the reality is the emissions from your diesel generator are less than burning coal at Huntley. So, yep, you can see the emissions directly, they're right in front of you. But the overall emissions for New Zealand are actually reduced when you run that diesel generator at times of heavily loaded, generation transmission system.
But doesn't that kind of speak to an engagement problem? Like, I know that we engage with the people that we work with and kind of our circles and kind of promote the use of using your backup diesel generator smartly. But where else in industry is that kind of engagement coming from? Like, I don't have the answers, but I'm saying that, if we are going to rely on these smarter customers, who's leading that and getting the customers clued up on it?
I think that's a real role for us, Aleida. I think that's one of the things we're going to do. We're going to work with customers so they can find low cost, easy to implement things, but also help them on the journey so they can think about all the things they can do to actually improve all their processes, all their investments to become much more low cost and low emission.
I think as we approach the end of the time here, I think that's a really good challenge that we can leave with people. If you are in the energy industry, such as a consultancy such as Deta, but you could be on the other end, you could be an end user. How can we improve this engagement between ourselves, reduce these silos that can occur and work better for this holistic kind of energy system that we have for better in New Zealand? And I guess in these last couple of minutes, I'd really just like to turn to both of you and give you a small platform to say, okay, what are your big takeaways from Downstream and what's the next steps? And probably just a minute each for that. Aleida, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think for me, I really like the conversations around the customer that came out of Downstream. But it did leave me kind of like with this feeling that we don't understand, well, the industry doesn't understand the customer. And I know that like we do quite a lot of work kind of bridging the customer to industry, but that more needs to be done at an industry level to get the understanding of customers, but not just the current customers, the emerging customers, like the decarbonized process heat customers, what their needs and requirements are going to be. What charge point operators' needs and requirements are going to be. The EV owners, like the new customers that are coming on board, there needs to be more done to kind of incorporate them into this energy strategy piece. So I think, I enjoyed the conversations around the customer. I think the real thing I took out of it was that there's not enough understanding from the industry level on who the customer is.
Fantastic, Roger.
I'll just go back to this theme I had is, we're going to get more wind and solar, which is uncontrollable. Load which flexes in response to that wind and solar is going to become increasingly important. And, we all have a role trying to work out how we get more flexible load there so that wind and solar, that uncontrollable renewables, we can absorb more of it. But at the same time, energy efficiency is still cheap ways of us keeping our lights on, and we mustn't lose focus on continuing to implement smart energy efficiency programs.
Fantastic. And so this conversation that we've been having today has been recorded and will be available online shortly after this. We'll also include the slides that you saw here today and a few others just to help that conversation along. So if anyone here, really encourage you, if you want to continue this conversation, please reach out. But I just want to take this time just to thank our panelists here today, Roger, Aleida. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives and thoughts on the industry. I'm sure this is not going to be the last. I think this is just going to be the start of many more conversations going down. So ngā mihi nui, thank you for your time. And to everyone who's here watching online and recorded later, thank you for coming along. And yeah, please feel free to reach out if you have any more questions. On that, thank you everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Cool.